I want to start this talk with kind of a disclaimer. And as our mycological side, we don't necessarily have an official position on topics involved with like psychoactive mushrooms. And so a lot of the focus or a lot of the ideas and thoughts are mine. All right, so don't hold CMS accountable. I'm not, I'm operating more from the perspective of respect for our history and respect for our elders. And I do try to stay objective with the information I'm presenting. A lot of eye candy, so hopefully I'm not gonna throw you off out there, but so there's a lot of information that I think is important to communicate and to share. All right, a lot of knowledge. All right, so to kind of start this, I want to first dedicate this talk to Dr. Manny Salzman. Right. Manny Salzman was a longtime CMS member. He was really the person who started the Telluride Mushroom Festival. And when I first started sharing that, hey, I'm interested in ethnomycology, he gave me photocopies of Gordon Wasson's Russia Mushrooms and History, segments of that, so I could start research. And so I have a lot of respect for the work he did and his contribution. So thank you, Manny, for being there. Right. All right. So as we get going with this, I think mushrooms are having a moment, right? And so if you have come across the film Fantastic Fungi, has anybody not seen this film here? Check it out. Netflix, Vimeo, Apple TV. It's a good one. All right, from a visual standpoint, beautiful photography, time-lapse video of mushrooms growing. But I think the biggest thing is that it's really exposing more people to really what this is all about, why we do this stuff, right? And so I think it's really neat to see that this is growing. I mean, we're seeing a lot more interest. The momentum is here, and we're in a good place, right? So kind of pay attention to that. And so if you are paying attention to this, like most mushroom related or mycophiles, I'm sure you're getting news feeds just for mushrooms, or am I the only one? I don't know. And so, I always am interested with all the different dimensions. Nike has got a mushroom shirt out. I bought one. Stamps. If you're familiar with Taylor Lockwood's photography, bioluminescent fungi is now U.S. government postage, right? Michael Leather, you got Adidas jumping on board. I don't think they've released these shoes yet, but there are Michael Leathers that are, for now, they're really targeting the high end, all the luxury items. We know cultivation. We've got some excellent cultivation educators here, and thank you for your contributions as well. Supplements. Right, there's many more brands that are coming and that are making more people aware, right? And then we have this, right? Every month, it seems like more and more locations, more and more cities are decriminalizing psychoactives, right? And not just psilocybin, but there's other compounds that are part of this, but momentum is changing. All right, and I think it's kind of interesting just to see the direction these things are going. All right, and so the term psychedelic renaissance is something that comes up a lot when you hear people talk about these things, and we have newspaper clippings. I know things are going in a more of a mainstream-ish direction when my mom gives me newspaper clippings of these articles. And this is like a local newspaper. This was from the New York Times, but I know if mom is aware of what's going on, there's a lot more coming out, right? And so New York Times, this was another one that my mom shared with me. And just the other day, this was published April 2nd in the Washington Post. More and more applications and clinical uses. I'm gonna phrase it that way because that's really where it needs to be. and we'll get into some of that stuff too. Michael Pollan, everybody familiar with his work? I think this really opened a lot more people's eyes to, hey, there's potential and there's something there, right? So this psychedelic renaissance is definitely something that we're part of, and it is interesting to see the direction that it's going, and I think it just brings a lot of hope for some people who might need these things, that they can be useful tools for people and useful treatments for conditions that we'll get into some examples of. All right, so in terms of my objectives, I've got some background here. We are going to look at the history, but I also want to say we're going to look at the herstory too, because women play a pretty big role, and I think they are often overlooked when people talk about Gordon Wasson and everything, but he had a wife, and she is the one who introduced him to mushrooms, right? And so we're going to look at a lot of the history from different perspectives, but also the pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican perspective. And then, of course, we're going to focus on Maria Sabina and look at her contributions and characteristics of her ceremony, and the Velada, which are the songs that were part of her technique as a shaman. Right? I do have a lot of references. At the end, I'll share a QR code if anybody's interested, and I'll freely share anything that I have here. And so I was pretty fortunate at the start of COVID to actually go to a library on March 13th, 2020, at the University of Denver Library. I was able to find some books that, because of COVID, I was able to keep them for almost a year. And I thought that was pretty awesome because, well, I had a chance to do some research, right? So thank you, University of Denver, and unfortunately, thank you, COVID, for that. But nonetheless, I'll share these references. Many of them are pretty hard to find. I think you can find stuff online and all that kind of stuff. But I think, I don't know if I'm old school, but I think nothing beats a good book. A physical book can do a lot of damage, right? All right, so some of the terms I'm going to focus on or reference or mention are things we got to kind of be familiar with. And from a historical perspective, obviously the term Mesoamerica, we'll look at some of that. Ethnomycology. Most of the talks that we have each month focus on physical sciences. I'm a high school social studies teacher. And one of the things that really hooked me when I started learning about mushrooms was the history and the culture and the humanities, right? And so those are things that I really enjoy and I like to learn about. Plus, I like to find mushrooms. Right? Mycolotry is a term we'll look at, and the concept of an entheogen. All right, I mean, it's one thing to call something a drug. It's another thing to call it an entheogen, and we'll look at the difference there. All right, the image that you see, can you guys see that? Let me see if I can do a laser. These are photos that were put together by or taken by Alan Rockefeller, and he's a really awesome photographer, an awesome collector. He's very active in Mushroom Observer and in Wikipedia, and so all of the images, all of the mushrooms are his. All right, so just to cite the source. And when you look at the different species within the genus Psilocybe, there's some diversity there. And so we'll look at some of these things here tonight. All right, so as far as Mesoamerica, with Mesoamerica, we're talking about a region, I mean, historical era, but for the most part, it is within this area of Mexico and Central America. And you can see my slides, okay, as I'm sharing, because I'm seeing all kinds of stuff. And sorry, I'm getting distracted. I'm a remote teaching veteran now, and I'm kind of getting a little post-traumatic stress because I'm back in the classroom with the screen here. But I had students, they wouldn't show their faces, or I just had boxes, but thanks for showing your faces. Ethnomycology, really this description actually is from David Rose. He wrote this in a Fungi magazine article. and I think the social cultural connections, that's really what ethnomycology deals with. And so the humanities are part of it, but also the social sciences, and so when we look at anything from an ethno perspective, we're looking at the human condition and what role the humans play. And so pictured in this photo are Gordon Wasson and his wife Valentina. And so I think, again, just recognizing that women were part of this in important parts. And so that's something we'll kind of examine here a little bit. All right, let me see. Dang it. Sorry, there we go. All right, so the next term, mycolotry, I don't think this really caught on too much, but this was a term that Gordon Wasson kind of created. And it really kind of deals with practices, mostly spiritual religious practices that involved the use of psychoactive mushrooms. And part of where he was coming from is starting to look at the impact and the role they may have played in human development and in religion and all these different things. So you don't hear this one much, but that's part of the title of my title, but it has to do with more the religious and spiritual connections. All right. And so when we talk about these types of mushrooms, we do refer to them as entheogenic, which kind of refers to bringing God from within. And I think, a lot of entheogenic behaviors, activities really involve a different frame of mind. People, and we're talking about these things, that they weren't doing things recreationally. They were doing them for a purpose. They were doing things for spiritual and for social awareness purposes. And so I think just the perception of what we're talking about is really different. And from a historical context, I think that it might be hard to really think about, well, what were they thinking and how did they understand these and why did they use this stuff? But that's all stuff that we'll get into. Hope there's our entheogen again. And so to call something an entheogen versus a drug really kind of suggests that there's a different intention there. We're not just doing this to party, right? Oop. I think somebody's in the waiting room. All right, let's go. All right, so we'll start with a little bit of geography. I'm not going to go into a ton of the physical stuff, but I think it is important to at least recognize the fact that there's a diverse habitat in this region. And even just from an edible mushroom standpoint, over 450 species of wild mushrooms are consumed in Mexico, both as food and medicine. I mean, that's amazing, the numbers, 450 different species. And so, the habitat is diverse. The mushrooms that we're going to look at, they definitely require certain types of habitats. And then, that's why they were there, right? And so it's important just to recognize that. Some of the other things, this map was something that Wasson put together that identifies regions or areas where these mushrooms were likely used pre-Hispanic times, right? Pre-colonial. And so I think just the fact that the geography is there for these things, that people were aware of it. People knew what was there. And so as far as the genus Psilocybe, there are many species within the genus that are psychoactive, some more potent than others, but this work was done by Gaston Guzman, who wrote the monograph for the genus Psilocybe. So he is a world-renowned, known for his work with Psilocybe. And as far as the species that we'll look at, we have a lot of, we have to give Mr. Guzman, Dr. Guzman, a lot of credit. And again, the photos that I'll share are were taken by Alan Rockefeller. All right, so to look at some of the species here, Many of these mushrooms were presented in the Life magazine article, and we'll touch on that. But I think it's interesting to hear the common names, all right? And when we think about naming something, it's not always a matter of a literal connection. And because these are ancient, this is ancient knowledge, some of the names might have been more metaphorical, or they might have been specific to the purpose or the uses, you know, and so Mexicana was the mushroom that Dr. Hoffman, the LSD chemist, used to help synthesize psilocybin and psilocin. And so I think that's a pretty famous one, but you know, this is the mushroom that was used for those that synthesis. Aztecorum, and I'll just kind of show some of the mushrooms. I think most of these, probably all of these, would fit into that category of LBM. And to truly identify these, you got to be careful. You know, you're not really going to find this in the Colorado, although there have been a couple specimens that have been found, but it's not as common as what you might see in other parts of the world. The landslide. And so very beautiful mushrooms as well. I think one that's probably the most familiar for many people is cubensis. And this actually originated from Cuba. That was when the first collections were found. And so I think it's really kind of got notoriety because it's one of the easier ones to cultivate and is, you know, is grown pretty regularly. And so the common name here is San Isidro. San Isidro was the patron saint of farmers and peasants. And so I think it's interesting to think that, you know, the groups of people that would have been exposed to these mushrooms, you know, they helped contribute to some of the history. Zapotecorum. The thing to understand with each of these mushrooms, they weren't always readily available. You know, I think definitely habitat conditions would have determined what you're going to find, when you're going to find it. And so not all the mushrooms were available all the time. And they did serve different purposes when they were available, you know, and so the potency of different species might have been part of that. But just to think they weren't always available there. I've tried this name. Anybody know this one? But the little birds, really kind of a beautiful little mushroom, right? But in Wasson's Life magazine article, this one was actually mislabeled as Zapotecorum. And so I think just the knowledge that has changed and evolved with understanding these mushrooms it's kind of interesting to follow, you know, the history and all that. And so again, you know, there were different regions, different cultures that were involved with the practice. And one thing I think it's important to understand that this didn't go away. It's still there, right? And so I think, you know, some of the things we'll look at, they may have exploited people like Maria Sabina, and there is like some tourism element, but these are also used for purposeful, you know, occasions and intentional actions. And so this just identifies some of the different groups that would have used, the indigenous groups that would have used the mushrooms and identifying different species. And so it's really region specific, you know, based on the habitat, based on availability and all that. All right, so we're going to get into a little bit of history. I'm not going to go into much. Number one, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a high school teacher, right? And so the history that we see with these groups, I mean, it's vast, you know, and relatively speaking, I mean, we talk about 3,000-ish years of time. And so whenever you look at any one example, you got to think, well, that's only one snapshot, right? Over 3,000 years, there's a lot of activity that could have happened. And so unfortunately, some of the artifacts that we do have access to are pretty limited to certain eras or certain time periods. And so we're only seeing little bits and pieces. We don't really see everything that was going on. And part of it's because of the Spanish influence, right? When they came to the New World, they did away with a lot of the religion that was already in practice. And so what we do have access to is pretty limited. All right, so that's kind of important to keep in mind. And so starting with the Olmecs, not a lot is known about the Olmecs. They were considered kind of one of the first great civilizations, not really any written record or history of their belief systems or their use of entheogens. Some of the artifacts are kind of open to interpretation, and as mycophiles, everything we see that looks like a mushroom is a mushroom, right? That's not always the case, but I think it is important to kind of think that maybe there is something to it. So this is an artifact that was a whistle, and the image may appear to be connected to Amanita muscaria, or the Amanita cap. And even Guzman had some thoughts about the connection with that, the interpretation and the effects of Amanita muscaria. And so Amanita muscaria, you do see here and there, but I think part of the problem was it wasn't as abundant. It's not as reliable, whereas psilocybes are pretty, they grow quite a bit, right? And so you do see some evidence of Amanita muscaria, but mostly psilocybe, and a lot of that's availability. All right, so as far as the Maya, a very advanced culture. And so the region that we're looking at here, let me do this. Kind of the Yucatan Peninsula area. And so as far as the Mayans go, just going to kind of breeze through some of this background information. It was really overwhelming to try to get into some of the history just because there's so much. And the things focused on mushrooms were more of what I was interested in, but the Mayan were very advanced. Were left behind quite a bit, quite a bit of architecture and artwork. And so the Mayans did have a lot of knowledge of plant and animal hallucinogens, all right? And so definitely experience with mushrooms, but also the frog or toad and the water lily. And water lily is kind of a narcotic type, has narcotic type compounds, right? And so they would be used in ceremonial situations, and they knew about this stuff. I think probably the most famous evidence we have from the Mayans are the mushroom stones. All right, and there is a lot of debate whether they actually involved mushroom use or were used in mushroom ceremonies. But I think from the shape, and this is a replica, obviously, there's not too many of the real ones out there. But when they have a base, that might suggest that there's some importance, that it can stand. And then some of the characteristics we'll look at as well may suggest that there's other connections. All right. So some of these details I'm really not going to read, but Wasson was very convinced that the mushroom stones were connected to the mushroom cults or groups, and so we'll look at some different examples of these. This is a pretty famous one that's currently in a museum in Switzerland. And so when you look at the characteristics depicted, there are connections to mushroom intoxication, dilated pupils, right? Wide-eyed stares, right? And even the grinding instruments, and I'll show you something here in a bit, that Wasson showed or proved that they were used for consumption purposes. And so like I said, not a ton of these out there. I think the number I've seen is even less than 300, you know, and some are in private collections, some are in museums. Every now and then you see them on eBay, surprisingly, but I mean, you got $10,000, you probably could buy one too. And they're not this good. They don't look as good as these. And so I always scour the museums and the websites to see if I can find examples. And so a lot of times you'll see connections with mythological figures and animals. And for the Mayans, the monkeys, the jaguars, I mean, these were all part of their belief systems. I'll just kind of go through these. And so to me, this one here is actually part of the collection of the Denver Art Museum. I've never seen it there, but it was identified in this source as a part of the collection. But here you see even the presentation of a mushroom and the dilated pupils, right? And so that might suggest that there was some activity going on. And even the way that the postures are and the shapes almost appear to be flying, right? And so we'll look at some of that here in a sec. So other art, some ceramics have come up, and again, there's a lot of debate on what the purpose was or what they are actually depicting, but I feel that there's got to be a mushroom connection there. This was also in the Denver Art Museum's collection. And so we see mushroom forms from the head, breasts. Again, a lot of mythological imagery as well. And this was one I came across the Mint Museum, and just thinking of the facial expression here. And so this was Guzman thinking that it almost appears that they're flying in space. You know, for Wasson, this was an example that he felt proved, in a sense, that his hypothesis was correct. And so with this stone, you see a grinding. And he observed in one of the ceremonies that he attended, a young girl grinding mushrooms as part of the ceremony. And so this, according to Wasson, was something that showed, hey, there is a connection here. All right, so that's the Mayans. Mixtec, another advanced civilization. Most of these groups had very developed governments, right? And the Aztecs, for sure, we'll get to that one. But one of the artifacts that we'll look at here does come from the Mixtec, and it's some of the only evidence we've seen of mushrooms in ceremony, part of the belief systems. And so a codex is basically a book, right? I mean, it's not necessarily paper per se, but a lot of skins were used for these. This is an example of one of them. And I've got better images that were kind of tuned up a little bit to show some of the detail, but this is one that does illustrate mushrooms in ceremony. And so the way these are read, it's kind of like counterclockwise. They'll start in the bottom right corner, and the story will follow that direction, right? And so this particular record that this codex focuses on belief systems and origin stories. And so gods of not just mushrooms, but corn and other important elements of their lives were explained and introduced here. And so in this case, we see many mushroom images. And so this research that I'm citing here, it was pretty extensive, and it actually included a Mixtec native speaker. And so they had a lot of good background information to determine that there is an entheogenic fungi connection here. And so basically the story involves the origin of the sun. All right. And so this is kind of the final piece of that. But the god Quetzalcoatl was one of the gods that was part of this story, this origin story. So these are just more detailed images, and these all came from the research that I found that I'm referencing. So I'll just kind of go through these a little more quickly. One second. Stand in the way of it. All right. So the Aztec, the next one, Nahuatl was another name that you'll see if you start looking for Aztec history. And they were also a very advanced civilization, urban civilization, a lot of agriculture focus, but a really complex government. And they would often require other groups to pay tribute to them, for their protection and their resources and all that. And so pretty large in number for sure, pre-Columbian, of course, polytheistic beliefs. And so they had a strong understanding, or a strong mythology played a strong role, or a big role in their culture. And so magic and occult forces were things that they practiced. And so as an advanced culture, they were one of the big ones. So their use of entheogens did involve communication with supernatural, but also part of preparation for war and battles, as well as human sacrifice. And so some hallucinogens would have been used, or entheogens would have been used to alter the perception of the captives who were being sacrificed. And this says lessen the pain, but I can't imagine that would help make things any better. I mean, when you think of what a person might be going through, that would be horrifying. I would imagine if they were under the effects of certain substances, but nonetheless. Plant hallucinogens or entheogens were an important part. And I think this is kind of an important detail, that it was really specialized individuals that were able to use these things. I mean, it wasn't just for everybody, right? They had a special group of priests, or the holy people to work with these things, and it wasn't just something that everybody could use. They had other entheogens that were used. Peyote was probably imported. I mean, the peyote isn't really in that kind of, doesn't grow in that kind of habitat, but they did have access to it. Datura, the common name Jimson weed. I don't know if that sounds familiar to anybody, but this is not a psychedelic per se. It's more of a analgesic, maybe, I don't know, hypnotic, more of a narcotic effect. Morning glory seeds, and I think this is more of a psychedelic, kind of connected to LSD in some of those compounds. And then mushrooms. And so with the Aztecs, we hear the name Teonanacatl, which is interpreted as God's flesh, or well, I'll get into some of that, and that did have an impact or played a role in their lives. And so, like I said before, there were specialized individuals who would use these medicines. Right? There were different rites and ceremonies, and so these were specialties. I mean, people, not just everybody would be able to access these things and use them. And it kind of makes sense when you think of the habitat they're part of. They knew their surroundings, they knew the plants, right? They knew the fungi, and so they did have a lot of understanding of how they work, and just to have access to what they were used for. All right, so the codices that we're going to look at, a little different than the first one I shared. Many of these are accounts that were made by European and the Spanish, right? And so there were some examples of European perspectives on what they were observing, but we got to keep that in mind. They weren't natives. They didn't know the purpose or the intention, and they probably didn't understand it, especially when their Christianity is their belief system. And the name again, John, that Sagun. All right, and so the Florentine Codex is one example that I'll show some excerpts of, and kind of explain the perceptions that came from that. So the term Teonanacatl, I mean, the Teo would be the sacred or divine. There's also some connection to modern interpretations of magic mushrooms, right? And so when you think of magic, the supernatural, the divine, the sacred, and then the flesh, obviously, that may be some of how the publishers of Life magazine came to that interpretation, or came to the term, because they were used for different purposes. And from an English interpretation, that the translation maybe was there. So I'm going to share a couple examples of some of the excerpts from these codices. And I think I'm not going to read all of this, but I think some of the things I highlighted, they would see visions and have revelations of the future. But even the fact that they are referencing the devil speaking to them in a drunken state, I mean, that's definitely an outsider's perspective based on their belief systems of what they're observing and what they're thinking about. But yeah, they all went to eat raw mushrooms on witch food. They all went out of their minds. I mean, that's definitely an outsider's perception. There's another part of the excerpt. And I think here we see, as far as consumption, how they were consumed, right? Eaten raw, being bitter. Honey was often used to kind of lessen the bitterness. And while later they would see 1,000 visions, especially serpents, and as they would be out of their senses, it would seem to them that their legs and bodies were full of worms eating them alive. And so again, we're seeing somebody observing this from a European Christian perspective. Other preparations involve chocolate, and chocolate is often used with the taking of some of these mushrooms, and ate the mushrooms with honey. And even this, they danced no more, only sat there nodding. This last piece of this interpretation, I thought was kind of interesting, where, I mean, it talks about the things they saw in vision and what their intentions were. But then when the effects of the mushrooms left them, they consulted amongst themselves and told one another what they had seen. And so the reflection afterwards of what did that mean, and how can we use that, I think is kind of interesting. And so some of the images that were also part of these are not literal interpretations, or the color green was kind of associated with sacred, objects and sacred things. And even some of the image here may have been presented by a European artist, because you get a sense of a devil-like figure approaching the individual eating the mushrooms. And so one interpretation with this example was that this may have been representative of Zepatocorum. And again, we know these mushrooms have a blue staining characteristic, but the color green was reserved for really important things. And so one of the gods, Xochipelli, the original of artifact is in Mexico City. I thought this was interesting. This I found in a government publication, but you can actually see this in Washington, D.C. You know, and some things you see adorning the body, we see mushroom caps, stylized mushroom caps, as well as other psychoactive or entheogenic plants. And so let's get this guy. Aztecorum was one of the images that was described here. And even the figure, one thing I learned, he's actually wearing a mask. So he's depicted wearing a mask. And so masks have a different perception, or different, they're different when it comes to mythology. This last one identifies what's believed to be Amanita muscaria. And you can see the stipe, and even the vulva, or what appears to be a vulva. And even the distorted presentation of the face might suggest intoxication of these compounds. All right. So from there, we're going to start looking a little bit more at the more contemporary examples. Gordon Wasson. All right. So he got a lot of attention, but like I said before, I mean, he's got to give credit to his wife, because she's the one who really helped him understand that mushrooms are not bad things, right? And so a lot of the work they did together was you know, just trying to help understand the human connection to the different practices. And some of what they were really focused on was how mushrooms may have contributed to belief systems and religion, right? And even one of the Psilocybe species is named after Wasson as well. But there's a second name because another group of mycologists beat them to the publishing rights. And so there's some controversy there, but anyway. So with his wife, Tina, most people have probably heard of the Life magazine article. Well, she also had an account published about a week after the Life magazine article came out, right? And so she was a Russian American. She was a doctor, pediatrician, and I think, you know, one thing I've seen with her contribution, she, as a doctor and with a medical background, had feelings that there is some use here from a psychiatric perspective. And so I think, you know, we definitely need to acknowledge her just as much as we acknowledge Gordon Wasson. And so unfortunately, she passed away shortly after the Life magazine article came out. So Gordon went on to pursue further work, and when we still have a memory of his wife. Has anybody seen this example? This is a pretty recent book. It's a graphic novel that really kind of goes into the Wasson's background. You can find it, you know, bookstores, Amazon. Really, really cool images, and just to kind of follow their story, you know. But yeah, Mycelium wassonii. This was just published in 2021. All right, so Wasson's contributions, were pretty big, right? The other thing that I've come across as I started learning about these this history, he gets a lot of credit, but he wasn't the first, right? I mean, there had been work with entheogenic practices from about the early 1900s, right? And so I think Wasson really was able to kind of get a bigger exposure more than anything. But some of the first rituals that he attended, he didn't participate. He didn't consume the mushrooms. It wasn't until 1955 where he actually consumed them, and so he's kind of given credit for being the first Westerner to have these experiences with Maria Sabina. All right, and so his magazine, once that was published, that changed the game quite a bit. So this image is the curandero. I think people might think a shaman, right? And this was the person who led the first ritual that Wasson attended, where he did not consume the mushrooms. And one thing that's kind of interesting to note, not every ritual was the same, right? And you think of regionally, or there's different groups or different communities. They wouldn't all do things the same way. When we look at Maria Sabina, she used song, right? Other curanderos might have only consumed them themselves and then asked the mushrooms. But there were variations of the rituals. All right, so Life magazine came out, really introducing Western culture to these practices. And again, the term magic mushroom was born. And whether that does us any favors, I don't know, but it is part of our language, people think about. And so Wasson didn't use Maria Sabina's name in the article. He used the name Eva Mendez. And so I think he did kind of make an effort to conceal her identity, because one thing she asked was that I don't want you to share this with anybody else. But I think word still got out, and once they started looking in these regions, they found who he was talking about. So in the Life magazine article, this is where we first see images or a field guide of Psilocybe species. And so, I mean, you think of how widespread Life magazine was. I mean, you see this end up in your mailbox one day and say, "Oh, what's going on here?" But this helped or hurt the awareness of these things. All right, one other little trivial thing: Wasson and the CIA. There are some stories that Wasson was a CIA agent, and I don't think that's accurate. But there were groups within the government that were interested in the effects of psychoactive substances, including mushrooms. And so the CIA had a front man, Dr. James Moore, who was a chemist. And he basically was the link to Wasson because they knew they were studying mushrooms. And so this group, which was really a group from the CIA, contributed to their explorations. This guy Moore, the chemist, did go with Wasson and took part in a ceremony. And as a result, he provided samples to the US government from those expeditions. From what I've read, Wasson didn't think too highly of this guy. He was kind of a pain in the neck. And I guess he was complaining about the food and got sick and all that kind of stuff. So Wasson really didn't know that he was involved with the government in that way. Some of these things I will read. And as far as the excerpts here, I mean, so we have Wasson's words and we have Maria Sabina. And so Wasson says, what an amazing thing that we should all be carrying this inventory of wonders around us, ready to be tripped into our conscious world by mushrooms. And Maria Sabina states, it's true that Wasson and his friends were the first foreigners who came to our town in search of the saint children, and that they didn't take them because they suffered from any illness. Their reason was that they came to find God. Before Wasson, nobody took the mushrooms only to find God. They were always taken for the sick to get well. Now, a couple things to think about with this. So we'll look at an example of some of the music that was used, and there are Christian figures, but from Maria Sabina's perspective, these weren't religious ceremonies per se. They were spiritual ceremonies for sure, but the intention wasn't to define God. You know, it was to find answers, and the mushrooms were the vehicle for those types of answers. And so this is part of my bibliography, to my references. Wasson published a lot on ethnomycology, and some of these are really hard to find as well. As far as, you know, even to afford them. Mushrooms, Restaurant History, I think there was less than 250 actual published books, and they were pretty expensive. You can find this online now. I mean, you can get the whole text there, but some of the others, other titles that Wasson was involved with. All right. So now to Maria Sabina. Her background, Mazatec, right? She did not speak Spanish. So some of the things that we'll see are translations of her native language. Veladas, her ceremonies were called veladas, and they involved ritual chanting, ritual singing, and I'll play an excerpt for us just so you can get a sense of what that was like. And unfortunately for her, she's kind of got the notoriety that she introduced the Western world to her native practice. And she took a lot of criticism for this from her people, and died in poverty. You know, she didn't benefit from any of this stuff. And in some ways she was coerced into actually sharing this experience with people like Gordon Wasson, but we'll get into that. All right, so this was kind of an interesting excerpt. And it talks about how she came to learn from the mushrooms. And I'm going to read some of this out loud. And so this quote really deals with how she became a shaman. And so her response is, the secrets that the mushrooms revealed to me are enclosed in a big book that the mushrooms showed me. My sister Anna Maria, years before, fell ill. I loved my sister, and I took many, many more mushrooms than I'd ever taken before. At one point, a sprite came towards me. He asked a strange question. But what do you wish to become, you Maria Sabina? I answered him without thinking that I wanted to become a saint, or I wished to become a saint. Then the spirit smiled, and immediately he had in his hand something that was not there before, a big book with many written pages. My soul was entering the world of the mushrooms, and I was seeing landscapes in the deepest depths of their world. And it was as though I had become richer, wiser, and in a moment I learned millions of things. And so from this account, or based on this account, I think I read like 30 pairs of mushrooms she consumed. I mean, you're talking a pretty serious quantity. But just to think where she went and what she learned when she got there, I mean, that just fascinates me when I look at that. And as a result, she knew, and she knew those were the things that she could ask questions to. So some of the characteristics, just going to kind of go through this pretty quickly. There were different versions of these ceremonies, as I mentioned, but I think the intention is a big piece of it. You know, they had to be performed or requested for really important reasons. And that's where I think Wasson gets a little bit of criticism, or a lot of criticism, because he kind of lied that, you know, that he had things that were going on bad that he wanted to get fixed, whatever. But mushrooms were always consumed in pairs, and thinking in terms of like the man and woman, you know, pairs of from a mythological type perspective. The quantity did depend on probably availability for one, but also the species or what was being consumed. And the shaman would also determine who would be able to participate. Typically, we're eating fresh and raw, sometimes ground up, as with the image I shared earlier, and taken with water. And this just some images of other mushrooms. And so I think, you know, the environment, sometimes when people talk of psychedelics, they refer to set and setting. You know, what mind frame are you in? Where are you located? And so darkness and isolation was always important. They did include people who would not participate and would kind of watch and take care of people. There were also rules. And so this was one thing I think that Maria Sabina regretted, that people started taking the mushrooms and not following the practice, not using the rules that they knew from the culture. And I think a big piece of this too is that it's the mushroom that's doing the talking. It's not the shaman. Just a diagram of the setting. And it's interesting that you know, there were also children present. They weren't necessarily consuming mushrooms, but this was a normal thing. It wasn't just something they hid away and you know, kept private. There were lots of people that were just there. So some of the symbols are probably more have more mythological importance, but there were various accessories. Another picture. And so we are fortunate that one of the Veladas was recorded, and I'm going to play an excerpt from one of them. But this was recently released by Smithsonian Folkways, and what you'll hear is one of the songs that were part of the ceremony. Let me make sure my audio is right. And so the translation here is English, but the rhythm of the song, I mean, this is poetry, right? And so you will hear, or there are Christian elements identified, but this wasn't a religious activity. You know, this wasn't, that wasn't the intention. Let's see if I can do that. Wow.
Chonga Kilianato, Chonga Vishiniato, Chonga Sisiniato, Chonse Caneniato, Chon Spiritoniato, Chonga Kilianiato, Haki Socrinato, Haki Susinato, Chon San Pedronato, Chon San Pedronato, Chon Butalinato, Chonga Jimhonato, Chonga Jimhonato, Chonga Totinato, Chonga Yinyanato, Hake Socrinato, Chonga Sandonato, Chonga Sandonato, Chonga Sandanato, Chonga Senato, Chonga Sandonato, Chon Spiritonato, Hake Susinato, Chon Spiritonato, Chon Angasenato, Chon Spiritoniato, Chon Angaseniato, Chon Ganicheniato, Chon Gaticheniato, Chon Hatenaiato, Hake Supinato, Chon Angashonato, Chon Anganyanato, Chon Angasenato, nato, cho spirito nato, anche sovrinato, cho gatto tenato, anche sovrinato, cho gatto cho gatto anche sovrinato, cho gatto tenato, anche sovrinato, cho gatto Chongati chenito, anche soprinito, chingati chenito, chongati danito, rasengati chenito, rasengati danito, rasengati danito, rasengati danito, rasengati danito, anche soprinito, asosinito, anche soprinito, Asosinito, Hina Aina Santismanito, Hine Santo, so Hine Santato, Nito, Santo, Nito, Santa, Nito, Santo, Shi Santo, Shi Santa, Shi Santo, Shi Santa, Santo, Santa, Shi Santo, Mi, Qua Shi Santa, Mi, Qua Shi Santo, Mi, Qua Shi Santa, Mi.
So I think I mentioned, every shaman had their own practice, and for Maria Sabina, poetry and music were part of her technique. And the thing with the music, so they would do the chanting, the songs, and then they might take breaks and talk about things and have a cigarette and hang out, and then they would come back and then keep going. And so, as far as Maria Sabina goes, I mean, she has kind of become the cultural icon for mushrooms and entheogenic uses, and not always in a good way, honestly. You see T-shirts with her image on it, and so I think it really takes away from, really what she was trying to accomplish. But nonetheless, I mean, these are symbols that people start to be familiar with. Just a couple other pieces of art. And this was a design that was created by Naomi Salzman, Manny's daughter, for the Telluride Mushroom Festival. This was actually the first year I attended, and had a really cool shirt. So just some last comments with Sabina, and here we kind of get a sense of maybe Wasson regretted some things. And so I'll read Maria Sabina's words and then Wasson's comments on that reflection. But before Wasson, I felt that the saint children elevated me. I don't feel like that anymore. The voice had diminished. If Netanyahu hadn't brought the foreigner, the saint children would have kept their power. From the moment the foreigners arrived, the saint children lost their purity. They lost their force. The foreigner spoiled them. From now on, they wouldn't be any good, and there's no remedy for it. And one thing I want to mention with that Velada, the one that was actually recorded, in the research I've done, it was described as not being as effective as some of the other ceremonies. And it wasn't clear if the presence of outsiders affected the outcome, or if the presence of recording equipment may have affected it. But here's Wasson's response. These words make me wince. I, Gordon Wasson, am held responsible for the end of a religious practice in Mesoamerica that goes back far for a millennia. I fear she spoke the truth, exemplifying her wisdom. A practice carried on in secret for centuries has now been aerated, and aeration spells the end. And so I think you do get a sense that he had some remorse for the impact his influence and his exposure had created. All right, so we'll wrap it up here. Thanks for your patience. to more contemporary thoughts. And I mean, if you've been following any of this research, I mean, there is more and more coming. This was one of the first more current studies that was done out of Johns Hopkins. And what they found was that mystical experiences can be significant that were experienced in these settings. Some things we have to keep in mind, we're talking about clinical use. We're not talking recreational here. And the researchers will admit that, hey, we're following all the protocols. We're doing it by the book because we know the results are there. We just want to prove it scientifically. And so one thing that you have to understand as well, they're not using mushrooms. They're using synthetic psilocybin. And mainly because synthetic can be regulated, the dosages can be measured more carefully. So they're not necessarily using a mushroom. But in the news reports, you always hear, oh, it's a mushroom, magic mushroom, this and this. And so that I don't know if that helps the perception, but that's something that you definitely have to be aware of. And so really, credible sources are starting to expose more people. The American Psychological Association, you go to their site, you search for psychedelics research, you'll see some things. Psychology Today. And so there are a number of conditions that the researchers are finding that these treatments can benefit, they can provide benefit from. And even the term microdosing, you probably hear this a lot now. This was a source I thought was really kind of interesting. This is a Marine Corps publication. And I think the idea here, where they were maybe suggesting that psilocybin or microdosing could be a performance enhancing drug, for soldiers. And even the comments here, to increase productivity, creativity, problem solving, ability, and flow. And so I think, just that more and more people are really starting to think, hey, how can we benefit from these things? This was another recent study published by the Johns Hopkins individuals, Johnson and Griffith. And here they're really just kind of reviewing the research, but showing, hey, these are some of the conditions that could potentially benefit from these treatments. And so we think about the effects of these compounds. There's still studies there's still research that needs to happen, but there is potential. All right, and finally, I came across this during COVID. I thought this was kind of an interesting article looking at, during isolation and lockdown, people were turning to things like psilocybin. And even just the statement here, as the COVID-19 generation turns to mushrooms in the hope of being guided to a better place, it's clear psilocybin has the potential to be a powerful teacher, whether it's bringing people deeper into a state of harmony with their bodies and the relationship with those around them, or out into a greater understanding of the world around us. And so I think, during challenging times, maybe there are some places to look. And so lastly, I've got, like I said, resources. And if anybody, I'm more than willing to share this stuff if you are interested. So thank you.